Good morning, everyone. To this Energy Visions event, my name is Kalina Roshakov. I cover European climate politics and policy for POLITICO Europe. And I'm happy to be hosting this event today. We're going to be talking about carbon removals and natural sinks. It's a very topical issue. There's a growing realization that slashing emissions by switching to renewables and green energy sources won't cut it. We won't be able to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement just by reducing emissions. We will be stuck with some emissions in some sectors, be that steel or cement, because of their industrial processes. And so now there's a growing struggle to find the solutions that will absorb this extra emissions. There's also the issue of what comes after 2050. The EU has set itself a goal of slashing net emissions to zero by 2050, but then of course the world doesn't stop. Something needs to happen after that, and again, we need to remove more carbon from the atmosphere than we put out. And so we're back to finding solutions, and so that's what we're going to be discussing today. We would like to thank our partner Shell for making this virtual event possible. I thank all the viewers for joining online, also for those that are stayed. We're a little bit delayed, but that won't hold us back. You can participate in this event by tweeting about it at POLITICO Europe. You can also ask questions via Slido using the hashtag EnergyVisions. And we encourage you to ask questions. That's important to all of our POLITICO events, even if they're virtual at the moment. If you're following us from the event website, Slido is embedded below the live stream window. If you're following us from Facebook or Twitter, go to Slido from your computer or phone, and again, use the EnergyVisions hashtag to ask your questions. And now it's my pleasure to give the word to David Hone, Chief Climate Change Advisor at Shell. Again, Mr. Hone will be taking questions via Slido, so please flag them now. And with this, Mr. Hone, the word is yours.
Right, well, thank you and good morning. So I want you to imagine for a moment that it is 2050. Perhaps your autonomous electric car is already waiting in the driveway to shuttle you to the railway station. And as you step outside, the house system shuts off most indoor electricity consumption. On your way to work, you start thinking about an event your company had participated in a few days earlier, the last allowance auction under the EU emissions trading system. Now that the EU has reached net zero emissions, there would be no further allocation or auctions. In fact, no more allowances. But there is the familiar sound of planes at the nearby airport as the 787 and A350 departures continue, seemingly without pause. Although the first hydrogen-fueled Boeing 808 and Airbus A500 planes can now be seen in the skies, a good proportion of air traffic still runs on jet fuel produced from crude oil. Biojet makes up the difference. The railway station you use is in an industrial part of the city. And the cement plant that was constructed there in 2030, using the most efficient process design of the day, continues to operate, running on natural gas. It was built to supply concrete foundations for the gigantic 20 megawatt turbines in the burgeoning wind energy market. These planes and industrial facilities are part of the 2050 EU landscape and continue to operate, but do so in the absence of allowances under the EU emissions trading system. How will that be possible? It's important to recognise that net zero emissions in 2050 does not represent a point in time when there is no fossil fuel use and therefore no emissions. Today, we are 70% dependent on fossil fuels for energy. And in the EU, and although that the number is clearly falling, it won't be zero in 2050. In some cases, the technologies required to remove dependence on fossil fuels don't yet exist, or are only at the earliest stages of their development. While some facilities using fossil energy should have carbon capture and storage operating by 2050, that won't be true in all places. Planes cannot do this, and there will be regions within the EU where local at-source carbon capture and storage either isn't practical or cannot be implemented. Rather, net zero represents a balance between remaining emissions and the remote removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. This can be achieved in the EU, but we need the policy tools to guide us towards such an outcome. The EU emissions trading system is an excellent candidate for change. Today, the emissions trading system operates by surrendering allowances against emissions. But when the system ceases to have allowances in 2050, what happens? The emissions trading system needs to progress from an allowance-based system to one that manages net zero emissions by requiring the surrender of sink-based units against annual emissions. A sink unit wouldn't be issued in the way an allowance is, but would be created through projects that captured carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and permanently stored it. There are broadly three ways to do this. One, through industrial projects that strip carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and store it geologically or use it in a way that offers near permanence, such as in making building materials. Two, through the use of biomass to create energy, but capturing and storing the carbon dioxide released in the process, which originated from the atmosphere as the biomass was grown. And there is a bioethanol plant doing this today in the United States. And three, by engaging in natural-based projects, such as rewilding and reforestation, or encouraging farmers to employ different grazing and cultivation techniques which help build soil carbon stocks. Verified removal units from these types of projects will need to be part of the emissions trading system so that some parts of industry and various energy system services can continue operating past 2050. But the change to the trading system needs to be well before 2050, ensuring that enough capacity can be created by incentivizing sink activity. A very early milestone would be establishing the certification process for removals within the EU, and that could be done quite promptly. Earlier this year, Shell released a scenario sketch illustrating a pathway forward for the EU to reach net zero emissions by 2050. In that analysis, industrial bioenergy facilities with carbon capture and storage start to operate in the EU by 2035. So just 15 years away, which points to market signals emerging in the 2020s for project activity to start. We also showed that a gap between what can be achieved and what needs to be achieved for net zero by 2050 also starts to emerge in 2035. This gap could be filled with nature-based sinks, at least until industrial capacity can catch up. But once again, this will require a commercial carbon sink mechanism to incentivize action. Also, we shouldn't forget about the period after 2050, at which point the world may require progressive regions such as the EU to extend their reductions into negative territory. In other words, having more sinks than emissions. Trading of sinks could be a valuable export opportunity for the EU. The EU emissions trading system is the right commercial lever to drive sink activity forwards, partly because of its carbon pricing structure, but also because it must evolve to become a sinks and sources balancing system by 2050 anyway. As part of the current rethink of the trading system, in preparation for 2030 and beyond, a sink mechanism should be included. Initially, this could simply be the recognition of sink units from projects within the EU, but should eventually be extended to global recognition of units. These would be transferred under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, along with the necessary safeguards to guarantee environmental integrity and the adjustment of trading partner carbon registries. Without action in the 2020s, through the emissions trading system, to incentivize carbon sinks and the subsequent follow-up in the 2030s, the EU may find itself unable to meet its net zero emission goals in 2050. So thank you, and I now hand back to our moderator.
Thank you very much, David, for already outlining some of the options that we'll be discussing in the panel and with a follow-up interview. But first, there was a question directed to you on Slido, and that is targeted at the company you work for. So what will Shell do itself to reduce its own emissions?
Well, Shell has been active in reducing emissions for 2 decades. I mean, we were one of the first companies ever to have an emission reduction goal back around 2000. But what we're now setting out is a climate ambition taking us through to 2050. And it establishes a framework where Shell, with its customers, will become a net zero emissions energy company. And so that will include a variety of changes. I mean, Shell is already getting into hydrogen activities. We're starting to invest in renewables. There's an increased drive within the company to reduce our own emissions because they will be at net zero by 2050. And we're working with our customers in areas such as aviation and industrial facilities, which I talked about, to help them reduce emissions, maybe through sustainable aviation fuels, through carbon capture and storage. A great example is the development in Norway of the Northern Lights project, which is a facility that takes customers' CO2 and stores it. Shell is a partner in that project. So there's many things going on, but they all sit within this framework that the company has established through to 2050.
Thanks. I guess as more and more oil majors are actually announcing climate targets, even ambitions to net zero, as you yourself said, I think also scrutiny will grow about how robust these targets really are and what measures will be used to hit those goals. And with that, we come back to the discussion at hand, naming carbon removals and what will be used to suck carbon out of the atmosphere. With this, it's my pleasure to welcome Tina Bru, Norway's Minister for Petroleum and Energy. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning.
Good morning to you. And let's hop right in because we're, I think, like a minute short. So let's race into the interview already. David already mentioned carbon capture and storage projects in Norway, and Norway being quite a leader in trying to get this technology off the ground. So let me just ask you, Norway has been investing and looking into CCS for a long time. Why is it so difficult and such a hard and lengthy process to apparently pull it off?
Well, there are many answers to that question, but one of the biggest ones is, of course, that per today, there really is not really an incentive because the price of just emitting the CO2 is low enough to make sure that you don't really need to go to the action to try to store your CO2 or to reduce the emissions. But the reason that Norway has been working on this for many years is basically just also because we know that if we are to reach the Paris Agreement, all experts say that you're going to not only need a huge growth in renewables, but you're going to need some kind of CCS technology to reach the goals. So there is clearly a need for this. We have long experience with this in Norway. We've been doing it for many years, at least the storage parts. And now we are trying to lift a new project to demonstrate the whole value chain from the capturing to the transportation to the storage part in the Northern Lights project that Shell was just mentioning. So I think right now you still need to have large state subsidies to kick it off, but on the long term, I think this is something that we're just going to need, and hopefully there will be more business cases for it when we reach net zero in 2050.
Project that you just mentioned, that long full value chain project, is Longship, no? That you announced, or that your government announced it in September. On that note, I mean, your prime minister, when she announced it, however, also made support from the Norwegian government conditional upon support from other countries. Why does Norway want or perhaps need involvement of others or collaborations in this project?
That was for the potential second capture project, because when we have been working with this project for the last years in Norway, there have been several different capture projects that we've been looking at. But the one that we said that we will fully finance alongside the industry, of course, which is also financing part of it itself, is cement production in Brevik. But what you are talking about is a waste incineration plant in Oslo, which we have said we are also willing to support financing for, but that is prerequisite that they also find alternative financing for the project. So we are fully financing the whole chain from capturing to transportation to the storage parts, but The one that you're talking about is if we're going to have a second capture plant. And in that perspective, we have said that we want also the EU or other countries to join in to make it happen. Because the Norwegian project is not going to be a success if Norway is the only country that actually follows through with this. We need other countries to also follow through on CCS projects, because without it, there's really no way we are going to be able to keep industry jobs in Europe, and there's really no way we are going to be able to reach our climate goals.
Thanks. Are you already getting signals from other EU countries or other neighboring, not only EU, but other European countries that are interested in this project, or is it actually harder than you perhaps thought?
Well, actually, in my perspective, I think the optimism and positivity towards carbon capture and storage has actually increased in the last years in the EU. I think that mainly has to do, of course, with stricter climate policies, that we know more about what is needed to reach the goals and what happens if we don't reach the goals. So in my view, there is really a lot of interest towards this from many different European countries now. And for our project Longship in particular, we have noticed a huge interest from many different, not only countries, but also industries that are looking for solutions to handle their emissions. And we're seeing it also in the Northern Lights project, which is the storage part of Longship, that there is big interest from other industry partners to not only store their CO2, but also looking at what kind of opportunities there are in getting involved with this. The Northern Light project has, for example, also signed a cooperation agreement with Microsoft, looking at how they can integrate their different perspectives in the project. So I think there is a lot of positivity towards this now, but we still need more. It's not going fast enough. We need more projects, not only in Europe, but globally. So we're hoping to be able to maybe show with kickstarting this project, putting a lot of state money into the project, but also with clear incentives for industry to join in, that we will kind of show the path for more countries to follow through with these kinds of projects.
I'd like to come back to the cost factor and the market barriers in a second, but because you were saying that you're seeing a growing interest or enthusiasm for capture and storage technologies, where do you think that initial skepticism or perhaps wariness also in the EU comes from, and are those reasons justified?
Well, on the one side, of course, it's the cost of it. Another important part of Norway's going through with this project is to try to reduce costs, to extract learnings from the project that can benefit other projects that may come later in other countries. So we definitely need to get the costs down. But I think also part of the skepticism has traditionally been about whether it's safe. We know it's safe. We've been storing CO2 on the Norwegian continental shelf for over 25 years in other projects. So with also going through with the Longship project, we're going to be able to show that it is safe. This is something that is doable. You can capture, you can transport in a safe manner, and also store in a safe manner. And I think that is kind of key also in a public opinion perspective, if we are going to actually see more countries follow on building CCS projects. Because if the public thinks this isn't safe, I don't see how this is going to be possible. So that's a big part of it, I think.
Thanks for mentioning the storage aspect. So far, we've talked more about the capturing of the CO2 from the atmosphere. I mean, Norway has, just due to its location, of course, an advantage. You have a lot of water around you, and you can also make use of perhaps depleted fields where you can store carbon. The Netherlands is a similar case. Not every country has that advantage. And as we see also in other storage discussions, be that nuclear waste or other, the issue of having something obscure being buried underneath you is a concern to public acceptance. So is CCS only a possibility for certain countries, especially those with access to either vast empty lands or the sea, or do you see it being taken up also in more landlocked places?
Well, it's a little difficult for me to answer that because, of course, my experience is with the kind of storage that we've been doing on the Norwegian continental shelf. But it is geological storage. So, I mean, I'm sure it's possible to do it in other senses as well. And we know that geological storage is safe because we're still doing it underground, even though it's out to sea. But I think also one of the most interesting things about the Northern Lights project is that it is trying to be how can I say, a kind of hub for other industry in other countries who maybe don't have storage facilities near close to where they're operating. That is kind of a really big part of the Northern Lights project, to try to get volumes from trees, from other industries to store in this project, not just in a region, but from other places. So maybe we're going to see several different, I think, storages around probably mostly the Northern Sea, at least in the short term. And that will build experience, it will show it's safe, and we're going to have the infrastructure up and running to be able to transport the CO2 to the storage. So I think we're going to have to look at it that way. But we're also going to need natural sinks, of course, not just the kinds that we're talking about here in the Norwegian project, but it's the combination of all of this, because it really is, in my view, impossible to reach the goals without more renewable energy and also more storage, both in natural sinks and in the kinds that we're talking about in the Norwegian Northern Lights project.
Yes, thanks for raising natural sinks. I think Norway is one of the big supporters of also afforestation projects abroad in developing countries and as part of the Paris Agreement negotiations. But to come back to something you just mentioned, meaning Norway wanting to become a pioneer as well as opening the market to some extent. Do you see CCS, given that Norway draws vast riches from its hydrocarbon reserves and plans to continue to do so, do you consider CCS as a new alternative energy industry that could potentially bring as much revenues as the oil and gas reserves have brought you in these last decades?
I think CCS in itself is not anytime soon going to be able to compete on the revenue side with traditional oil and gas operations. Of course, that's just not going to happen. But I think we're going to see new kinds of industries pop up around putting this infrastructure for CO2 in place. And of course, there will be a potential for making clean hydrogen when you're storing the CO2 from natural gas. So that is one perspective. But it's really important for me also to say that the Norwegian Longship project that we're now spending a lot of money on has to do with industry processes. And I think that's really key, because this is not just about value creation for something new to replace what we've had before. It's about actually keeping industry and keeping jobs that we know we are going to need in the future. That we can keep these kinds of jobs in Europe and in Norway. So the Capture project in the Norwegian Longship project is cement production, which is something we're going to need. It's a hard to abate sector. There really is no alternative. So this is not just about the Norwegian oil and gas resources, because the big part of this project has to do with something totally different, cement production. And this is what we know that we're going to have to see deployed on a bigger scale in Europe if we're going to reach the goals and time keep industry jobs in Europe, or else there really is no room for it, because we need to tackle the emissions.
Thanks for this. I'm quickly switching to Slido, where you've already been getting a number of questions. From one, for example, from Andreas Graf, who works with Agora Energiewende, a German think tank. He's asking, when is the earliest you could possibly realistically see the first 1 million tons of non-Norwegian CO2 stored in Norwegian offshore storage?
I think it's difficult to give an exact answer to that, but the plan is for the whole project to be up and running by 2024. And we know there are a lot of intention agreements already from several different partners that are looking to perhaps store their CO2 in the Northern Lights project. Both Equinor, Shell, and Total, which are the ones running this project, are telling us that there's a lot of interest. So I think at least by 2030, perhaps, we're going to see several million tons stored from other sources than the Norwegian sources. But of course, the capture in Norway is important because we need to have that base load volume at the beginning to show that it's possible. So that is key for this project. But the incentives and the agreements that the state has gone into with the industry partners really give them a strong incentive to try to reach volumes from other outside industry partners for storing in the Northern Lights project. So that has been really key for us the whole time since we started working with this project. And I think where we are now shows that this is something there is a big possibility will happen.
Thanks. There's also another question that says from Anonymous, surely there's no space for fossil fuel consumption in the 2050 landscape. Should carbon dioxide removal not be used to solely compensate for unabatable emissions? Do you agree with that?
I think sometimes we kind of talk about how we are going to reach the climate goals as some kind of technology competition. What are we going to need? Is CCS going to backtrack us on renewables? Are we not going to see growth in renewables because we're going for some other technology, hydrogen, for example? But in my view, we're going to need all these kinds of technologies working together if we're going to have any hope of reaching the goals. The challenge is huge. It's going to be very, very difficult. We are going to need fossil fuels for a very long time moving forward. Possibly we're going to need it also after 2050, but then in a sense where you are handling the emissions. It's not like you can just switch a light off or on and then you're just moving from using fossil fuels in many, for example, different industry processes over to using renewables. You're going to need a combination, and then you're going to need some kind of technology to handle the emissions that you just can't get rid of. So I think we're going to see a lot of it, but we're also going to see a lot more hydrogen. We're going to see more renewables, of course, and we're going to need to see new technology on many of these industry processes if we are to also see industry jobs in Europe when we get to that point.
Thanks. I can imagine that you get that a lot, that of course with Norway's petroleum minister saying we will need fossil fuels beyond 2050, that many will say, well, naturally you will say this because why would you undermine one of your country's big cash cows? So on that front, do you actually already calculate an end to your oil and gas sector? And is the timeline becoming nearer and nearer, or are you literally just working on the assumption that you will find a way to make fossil fuels somewhat functionable, even in a very climate neutral world?
I think we're of course going to use a lot less fossil fuels when we reach 2050. There's no doubt about that. And the baseline for Norway's petroleum policy is that we produce profitable resources. If they're not profitable, we're not going to produce. So it's kind of, I mean, there are many different scenarios bringing us to 2050. It's kind of hard to sit here and now say, what is the oil price going to be in 2050, for example. So we don't know. But I think we're going to see, of course, fossil fuels being used without emissions because you perhaps have converted them to hydrogen or you have found some other way to abate the emissions. But we're still going to be needing them for petrochemicals, etc. So there will be either way. But we know that what is driving the push for CCS on the Norwegian continental shelf is mainly that we have had really ambitious climate policy alongside our petroleum policy for many years. We are a part not only of the ETS, but we also have a separate carbon tax on all our oil and gas production, which gives clear incentives to cut emissions on the NCS and also have as low possible amounts of emissions from production from the NCS. So I think we're going to see that being a driver in the oil and gas industry as well, that there's going to be a competition on producing the oil and gas with low emissions. But of course, it's when you start using it, whether it's in transport or industry or to heating, that you're having the big emissions issues. So we have to tackle it on two different fronts, I think. But we're not going to be producing oil and gas in Norway if it's not profitable anymore. But I think it's too early to say at what point that will happen.
Thanks for that. Just to go back quickly to Slido, and to go back already, since you were mentioning the EU's role, there's someone who was asking, does the EU's decision to grant a priority infrastructure status to a CO2 storage project, Porthos, in the Netherlands, sends a market signal that changes things? Would you agree with that?
I'm sorry, I can't see the question. Could you repeat?
Yeah. Someone asked whether a recent EU decision to actually grant a priority energy infrastructure status to a carbon dioxide storage project called Porthos sends a market signal that changes things.
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree to that. And it's kind of also in line with what I was saying earlier, that I'm seeing a shift in positivity towards this. And I think it's really key that the EU is moving forward on CCS, seeing it as a solution. We need that support. Now you have the EU Green Deal. You have many ambitious strategies on hydrogen, all kinds of different things, and embracing carbon capture and storage as part of the solution and a needed part of the solution, I think is really important, because we need also industry to be willing to invest. I mean, the Norwegian project, of course, has a lot of state money involved. We're picking up around 80% of the bill, but that's still 20% paid for by industry. So giving the signal to industry that this is a part of the future, I think is key to be able to move forward.
Thank you. A more personal question to you. If I look around the titles of energy ministers in the EU, I don't think you would see in anyone still the old economy, the old fossil fuel economy in the name. I think even Norway's state energy company has changed from Statoil to Equinor. So how does it feel to be probably the last petroleum and energy minister in Europe?
Well, I don't know if I am. I'll have to find that out. But I think, in my view, the oil and gas sector in Norway plays a huge part in actually making that new technology. The competence that we already find there, the technology, everything that they've done, it's from this industry that we're going to build new industries, whether it's in hydrogen, it's carbon capture and storage, if it's offshore wind. I think this industry is really key, and it's going to be a lot of the same people that have built this industry will be building the new industries. So for Norway as a country that has a big oil and gas sector, but at the same time a huge renewable sector, I mean, our power sector is 100% renewable. It makes sense to have these two things in combination. So I'm proud of the name, and I think also we can show with what we've been doing that this is part of the future, and we need to find solutions together.
With us, thank you very much, Ms. Bro, for joining us this morning, and I look forward to discussing many of the points you've raised with our panel.
Thank you.
Now, turning to the panel, just I would like to kindly remind you that you can participate online by tweeting about it at POLITICO events and asking questions via Slido using the hashtag #EnergyVisions, which you're already doing very frequently. So thanks very much for those questions. I'm going through them, or at least I try to go through them step by step, trying to manage the various screens. So, but now, please let me welcome the panel. First up, Bas Eickhout, well-known Greens MEP from the Netherlands. He's been very actively involved in EU climate policy and has been branching out not only from environmental to everything to finance, agriculture, and pretty much anything you need to know about climate. He will have something strongly worded to say about it. Then it's my pleasure to welcome Janneke Gerne-Berkers, the Director for Carbon Capture and Storage at Fortum Oslo Varme. As already the Minister was mentioning some of the carbon capture projects in Norway, Janneke will be able to tell us more about the underground challenges and possibilities. Then let me welcome Gert-Jan Nabos, a Professor for European Forest Resources at Wageningen University. I do apologize, the lack of Dutch pronunciation, the g, I've never managed to master and probably won't ever. And finally, but certainly last but certainly not least, Mauro Petriccione, the Director General of the Commission's Climate Department with the European Commission, who has to not only sell the European Green Deal to pretty much everyone, and especially China, but also has to force through all the policies that will make tougher climate emission goals possible. And with that, I would like to actually start with Mauro. Based on the discussions and based on the hopes of the Norwegian minister that many EU countries and companies will get involved in carbon capture and storage technologies, the European Commission just in September announced a plan to raise its emissions reduction goal to 55% by 2030. That's a considerable leap from the current cut of 40%. You've also announced quite a potential revolution in EU climate policy by accounting for carbon removals from sinks, which in itself started a big debate, so I'd be happy to talk about that later. But now turning to the technological possibility, how much will carbon capture and storage technology actually play a role by 2030, and will we be seeing lots of plans and projects popping up across the EU?
Thank you, Karina. Happy to be here. Look, carbon capture and storage is a technology that we believe in enough to want to finance innovative projects, as we will under the Innovation Fund, but we are not relying on carbon capture in our calculations, either for, certainly not for 2030. 2050, we expect that it will be difficult to reach net zero without a component of technology-based carbon removals, although the main, the brunt of the carbon removals that we will need to reach net zero is going to be through the natural sink, which incidentally is not doing particularly well in Europe or anywhere else in the world. So action there is urgent. But I want to make one important point. While carbon removals are, in our view, an essential part of the picture, they are not the main driver of climate neutrality. The main driver is decarbonization to a very, very, very large extent. As one of our listeners said, you quoted them before, yes, we do think that carbon removals is needed for unabatable emissions. And there's plenty of those, unfortunately, at least with current technologies. We do not envisage, and we're not planning for a Europe where you can continue to happily use technologies which we have now, which emit CO2, counting on the fact that you can capture that CO2 and store it somewhere. So things may change, but at the moment, on the basis of what we see in the forecast we are able to do, our plans are for full decarbonization of our economy. Some emission, notably in agriculture, are very difficult to abate, if at all. And then we will need a very important carbon sink by 2050 for that, which incidentally is also the reason why we are changing the methodology for 2030. The 2050 analysis anywhere in the world, including the scientific analysis by the IPCC, is based on a net zero concept. Now that we are redoing our maths and redoing our policies in light of that objective, I think we have to align our methodology, and we may just as well do it now rather than wait and confuse matters even further.
Thank you. I have a quick question to follow up also, which has been already raised by a number of people on Slido. You already mentioned sinks. I guess for those that don't follow the EU political jargon, thankfully, all the time, what we're essentially talking about is either forests or other land use, be that peatlands, that can absorb and store carbon. The European Commission, with its September proposal, has very much put a emphasis, as you yourself say, on sinks, which, however, got you quite a lot of criticism. Why do you think that the perhaps much needed shift of focus also to the natural resources was met with so much skepticism from environmental campaigners as a possible source?
On the use of this expression, I'm afraid we're in good company, since it's an expression which is used by all United Nations and international organizations. I had to learn myself what a sink exactly was, so I would sympathize with those who need a clarification. Look, I understand the concerns behind the criticism. The concern is a very legitimate one. First of all, is this an accounting trick? Secondly, even if it isn't, there is an issue of moral hazard. It's exactly what I was trying to warn against a few minutes ago. If by believing that accounting for the sink and working on afforestation and working on forest conservation and better management of commercial forests and better agricultural practice and for improving our carbon sink, we can solve the problem of climate change, that would be very, very mistaken. We are totally aware of that. I think we can afford to make that necessary change now because our policy has the necessary credibility and the necessary public support that the moral hazard issue is manageable. I'm not saying it does not exist. We are concerned about it as much as our critics are. We just think that that change had to be done. This is a good time to do it because we have a situation in the public of very, very strong support for these policies. And I think once this is explained properly, you can manage the risk of a moral hazard. But that is why we will continue to insist that this is a policy of decarbonization of our society. We need a zero carbon power generation sector, a nearly zero carbon industry. We need fully clean mobility, and we need a land sector, the use of the land, which provides a healthy carbon sink, certainly a healthier one that we see nowadays. Is there room for technology-based carbon removals? We would hope so. We would love to see that. We have been waiting for that to become viable, and we haven't seen that yet. So we haven't lost faith in technologies. We continue to invest in technologies, including CCS, but we don't plan our objectives on technologies which are not readily available, commercially viable, and capable of being scaled up. We plan conservatively on the basis of what we know for sure. And that's why CCS is part of the broad long-term picture. It's not part of our actual policy plans.
Thanks for this. I'd like to come back in a bit to the question of where regulation can come in to make sinks and forests a regulated sector of the EU's climate ambitions. But first, turning to Bas, having spent so many years fighting over climate policy in Brussels, how do you experience this discussion now about carbon removals? And does it also require a change in positions from, for example, green policymakers and the environmental movement?
Well, good morning, everyone. First of all, some of these elements do feel a bit like a Groundhog Day, to be very honest. When I hear Shell talk and putting their kind of full reliance on everything needs to come from ETS, that has been the position of Shell for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, as long as I know Shell. And we can now very clearly conclude that if there had not been very targeted policies on renewable energy, including the European Renewable Directive, the development of renewable energy would not have been so tremendously successful. So it is very clear that it's good that we were fighting for separate policies to promote certain technologies like renewables. Shell has always been against, and basically when I hear David again, it's kind of, oh no, it all needs to come from ETS. So maybe their question should be more to Shell. When are you going to learn from the history instead of just repeating your old position? I think the same holds a bit for why is there criticism on CCS? And I think there, I have to say, I almost everywhere agreed with Mauro. And that doesn't happen always, but when I heard Mauro, I think on 95% we agreed. And I see Mauro being happy with that. So good morning, Mauro. Where I don't agree, but we will get to that, is the net sinks part. I think there we have still a discussion to have. But on all the other parts, I agree. And what is very important, what Mauro said, is that on many sectors, we are planning decarbonization. I have always acknowledged that CCS can and will play a role if we are looking at the total climate neutrality, and indeed after we have to go to negative emissions, then some sort of, carbon storage needs to take place. I have never been against that. The problem, however, is where is it going to be linked to? And also here we can learn from the history. When CCS debate started in Europe, it was very much linked to coal-fired power plants. We were very critical back then And I'm happy we were, because now no one is talking anymore about coal-fired power plants that are CCS ready or whatsoever. It's now everywhere acknowledged that coal needs to be phased out. Just imagine if we would not have thought that idea that you can have CCS linked to a coal-fired power plant, it would have delayed the debate on a coal phase out. So we have won that discussion, and I think that is very important. And that's why we still look critical to the kind of the mantra of now CCS, certainly when a company like Shell is pushing it. Let's be honest, the big majority of the investments of Shell is going in further fossil exploration. So as long as Shell is putting the majority of its money in there, we will fight Shell. And then, of course, when they say, oh, and now we need CCS, we only see that because they want to maintain their fossil company. Well, sorry, then you have a problem with us. Because as Mauro said, if we are talking about carbon storage, we have to look at the land sector, and indeed we need policies there. And we have to look at some of those applications where we do know that really abating emissions is difficult. That's not in the energy sector. That's to a large extent not in the transport sector. That might be the case on aviation, and we have some issues in industry. So if we are going to look in those sectors, then there is a potential for also technologies around CCS, but you do have to look at those technologies. And this is also to the minister, Tina, when she said, yeah, this always seems to be a competition of technologies. The problem, of course, here is, from a policy perspective, we need to choose where we put our money. I mean, in an ideal world, indeed, let's try everything and let's evolve everything. But we also do know that money, certainly public money, is scarce. So we have to think very carefully where public money is spent on. And then you do have to have a discussion on which applications you want to develop, you want to support, you want to see being developed, and where you feel like, nah, this technology is being used to maintain a technology, a business that can go to decarbonization instead. So why would we do it there? And that's the political arena, and that's the political debate we need to have. And that's where the discussion starts. So I think there's a lot to be learned from the history, but I think you mainly have to ask that to companies like Shell, to be very honest.
Thanks for that. And with that, I turn to Yannick, who actually represents the industry here. And I think just to Bas's point, I think that's also a long-running discussion about climate policy as such. Do you go via the market, or do you set regulation that really tries to promote either certain energy policies or not? And I think, at least as long as I've been in Brussels, I've seen that debate boiling over from time to time. And especially now, I think as policymakers are increasingly aware that time is running out and that solutions need to be found rather sooner than later. That discussion is an interesting one, especially with quite a big chunk of the market is moving forward, especially in the renewable and clean energy technology space. But now to Janneke. You're actually involved in carbon capture storage technology projects on the ground. I mean, your professional life essentially depends on it being a success. So how do you see this, the political discussion and the political comments from a industrial perspective?
Well, I think that we mostly agree on the important points, which is that CCS is a technology that we need in order to reduce emissions fast enough. We need CCS in addition to renewable energy, forestation, and all the other measures. So we need all measures to reach our goals. We also, I think, agree that CCS, the technology, is mature. It's still early, but it's mature and ready to go, and it's a very effective climate measure. As you said, I'm representing the industry, and my project is also a part of the Longship, the Norwegian Longship project. So what we are trying to do is to establish carbon capture from waste to energy, a large waste to energy plant in Oslo. And I think we also need to realize that waste and waste handling is one major climate issue that we need to work on to reduce emissions from waste handling in the whole value chain. And the main measure will be to move away from landfills, because that's really connected to large methane emissions, and we need to move the waste away from landfills and into more sustainable ways of treating the waste. That includes sorting and recycling of the recyclable waste, but it also means a sustainable end-of-line solution for the residual waste that we really can't recycle or don't want to recycle. And today that is waste to energy, where we utilize the heat from the incineration, and then by adding CCS or carbon capture and storage to this process, we manage to take down these last hard to abate emissions from waste handling. And one other issue with waste is also that about 50% of the CO2 that we are emitting is it's bio CCS or biological, because we are burning partly biomass. So this is how waste to energy business can really contribute to reducing large emissions from Europe and to compensate for those more hard to abate emissions from other industries. I think I would also like to mention that waste to energy is largely connected to cities and cities' climate goals, climate works, and waste handling. And by adding carbon capture to these emission points, this can largely contribute to reducing emissions from waste in the cities.
Thanks for explaining a bit the project. Just to come back to something that Mauro, for example, was saying, namely that Brussels is not opposed to the technology and is happy to help support it. However, the question is whether it's commercially viable, and that's already an issue that also the Norwegian minister has raised. Where do you see that? Is it commercially viable, and why is it so difficult to reduce costs, for example?
Well, it's clearly not commercially viable today, and that's why we need the state support from Norway and other governments, and for our project, probably also from the Innovation Fund. It's still early in the development. We don't have that many carbon capture projects, which means that we need to obtain more volume and more projects in order to get that technological development and to achieve these cost cuts. And I think that we, as Tina was also mentioning, it's too cheap to emit CO2, and that doesn't really give incentives to reduce the carbon emissions. So we need incentives to reduce emissions, and we also need incentives in place to capture the biological CO2, because they are really not counted anywhere, and there's no incentives to capture them either. So I think we should also look not blindly at the costs, but also at the value of carbon capture, because it's a very effective climate measure. Even though it's not commercially viable, it's a very effective climate measure that we do need to roll out on a large scale to reach our climate goals.
Thank you very much, Janneke. I would like to turn to Gert-Jan now to return to forests and natural sinks. Janneke already mentioned biomass. It's a heated topic often in Brussels. To what extent can you actually rely on nature to fuel your energy needs? From a researcher perspective, how do you see the current debate around sinks as a climate measure in EU climate policy, and what are the concerns or potential risks that you see?
Yeah, thank you. It's really nice to be on this panel. I certainly want to iterate also what the minister mentioned, and also Mauro mentioned this, that all the sectors need to make their contribution to solve the problem. And it's very clear from the research that forests alone are not going to solve the whole problem, but they can make a vital contribution. And that's also that's in the mainstream research really comes out, that the role of forests in mitigating climate change both storing carbon in the forest, providing renewable resources as well, providing also wood for building wooden houses, and then in the end, maybe also partly biomass for bioenergy. That whole chain can make a vital contribution to the EU's climate mitigation goals, and that's how we should see the whole arena. Not very polarized in either only storing carbon in the forest or providing enormous amounts of areas for biomass, for bioenergy, which are in some publications as well. But it's this middle range of a very realistic scheme of what you can achieve with the European forests. A little bit of afforestation. The Timmermans plan with 3 billion trees is in fact very realistic. It comes down to maybe a few million hectares reforestation and restoration per year, which is very realistic. And then indeed also investing in good management, investing in producing also the products that we want, and investing at the same time also in biodiversity conservation. And that whole set, that whole scheme is really what can make a very good contribution.
You say it's realistic to add a couple of billion trees. I think, at least when I was researching the topic a while ago, there was also criticism from some forest experts saying 3 billion aren't going to cut it. It's not about adding 3 billion trees and then you have like the climate problem solved in the EU. But there's a wider problem, and something that already Mauro has also mentioned, that has to do with the general state of forests and how forests might be able to interact with climate change. And as such, there's been criticism that it might be risky actually to rely on natural sinks as an integral part of your climate policy, because as much as you would love to have forests and peatland and other natural solutions around, they already suffer from worsening climate change impacts.
Yes, that is right, and there is indeed this risk of under the natural sinks that you might lose the sinks, and there is indeed a small trend in European forest that the sink at the moment is getting smaller. We do see the effects of the heat and drought on Central European Norway spruce, the bark beetle problems there. That is indeed happening, and therefore we must invest in these forests and plant and establish a forest that is better adapted to climate change, and a forest that is also forest restoration and conserves biodiversity in a better way than what it does today. And then, well, that's the only way to keep at least a reasonable forest sink in place, and at the same time also produce renewable resources.
Thank you for that. That also brings me back to Mauro and the question about where regulation comes in to help either restore or maintain the health of forests. There have been actually quite a lot of questions on Slido that are going into that direction. There's one from Kate Abnett, a climate reporter with Reuters, who asks you, Mauro, specifically, is the Commission considering adding carbon removals or carbon sinks to the EU emissions trading system as part of the upcoming ETS reforms that we will see next year? And there were other questions that were going in the same direction, namely, how will the European Commission see the inclusion of agricultural and non-CO2 greenhouse gas emissions in the climate sector's policy?
I can imagine the tenor of the question, but let me start from your last question to Gertjan in his reply. The human mind likes simplicity, but when we will not make it if we don't understand that our salvation lies in managing complexity. In the same way, we must move out of a single, easy-to-use, very efficient power source, which is fossil fuels, to a multiplicity of sources, which in their own domain can be as good and as efficient, but none of which can replace fossil fuels everywhere. We are going to move towards a complex system. The same is true on a larger scale. The bulk of what we need to do is decarbonization. Now, decarbonization is not sufficient because we have a large problem of non-CO2 greenhouse gases, which we is not at the forefront of our mind now because CO2 is much more pervasive. But if we hadn't adopted international agreements and very effective regulation on F-gases or ozone-depleting substances, we will be immensely worse off. So methane is another issue. We do need urgent action on reducing methane emissions. And some of them are perfectly avoidable, like fugitive emissions from pipelines. Others from livestock are more difficult, but not impossible. There are things that can be done. So when we say we shouldn't rely on the carbon sink because it is in danger, I don't agree. I think what we're saying is that, first of all, we should never rely on the carbon sink for things it cannot do, and it cannot solve climate change, full stop. Secondly, to the extent that we need the carbon sink, because we do not have alternatives, we need to act to improve our carbon sink, and not only ours, but abroad. Now, on that, we are revising our regulation on the use of land. We're also revising our regulation, which is called the effort sharing, which covers the non-CO2 emissions from agriculture, basically by throwing it back at member states. This is your target, do something about it. Now, that doesn't work. And as Bas was saying, you can't rely on a single system. You can't rely on the ETS to fix everything, and you can't rely on giving targets to member states to fix everything. You need a combination of policies, and you need a combination of sectoral European level regulation to back the efforts that the companies are doing because of the ETS, and to back the efforts that member states are doing. So we are looking at that regulation. And one of the options on the table, we recently published our public consultation paper on this, is to actually bring all emissions from the land in one single instrument, and create incentives for acting in various directions. And by bringing everything together, give member states and give operators the flexibility to act where they feel best equipped for that. Secondly, we need, in a variety of ways, to improve our forest management, to improve our agriculture practices, to improve our conservation practices, and we are going to create opportunities for private capital to invest in the carbon sink. We have announced in the Farm to Fork strategy a strategy for carbon removal certification. What has prevented carbon removal certification from really taking off so far has been that, in spite of the very laudable attempts by some private organizations, some NGOs, we do not have a valid, publicly backed, publicly guaranteed, robust accounting and certification system. And we are now working on how would that work. It's not as simple as it seems, otherwise somebody would have done it a long time ago, because we've been talking about this for decades. So we are improving our knowledge of this. We will start pilot schemes for carbon farming, and we will make a legislative proposal in 2022 or 2023. We do hope, with a bit of luck, to have the entire picture, if not fully agreed and enacted, even though on this issue, I think the Council and Parliament can act much more swiftly than they would on other issues. We might even have the whole system in place before the end of this, of the mandate of this Commission. And the real question is, we need better scientific knowledge on adaptation of our land and our forests. The point Gert-Jan was making, there is knowledge, but it's not always, and it's not always usable in policy terms. That is going to be one of the main focal points of our adaptation strategy that we will present in February. And again, it's not going to provide you the answer to everything, but it's going to put squarely on the table the issue that our forests, whatever they are, whether they are commercial, whether they are what's left of natural forests in Europe, are in danger even if we continue to protect them with the knowledge that we have today. So we have to improve, we have to adapt, we have to change, we put the issue square on the table, and we will try to create a mechanism through which we can gather the knowledge and the effort to solve it. And this is a very different operation than what we've done on industry and power generation, where we rely on a few thousand of operators. This is a very, very diffuse operation. This has to involve public authorities, private operators, citizen, local authorities. Again, complexity. It's not going to be simple, but A, it's necessary. B, we are confident it can be done if we get ourselves organized.
Thank you. So just to recap, based on the questions formulation, there might be in the coming years a moment when you will propose using carbon removal certificates in the EU's emissions trading system.
There will be.
From as early as 22, 23. Okay, well, thank you for that. That makes me now turn to Bas and Gert-Jan and Janneke as a broader question, since you're all somewhat involved in it. And Mauro already mentioned forests as well as carbon farming. So we're moving into the era of agriculture, which has usually not been tackled that much by climate policymakers. Just a question to you in the broader policy challenge of removing carbon. How big a problem is the agricultural sector for all of these plants? And especially how big a headache is the currently ongoing reform of the agricultural reform to any of these discussions to use, I see Bas already laughing, to using sinks and natural resources more actively in EU climate policy? Bas.
Yeah, so I would never call a sector a problem. I would call the policy a problem indeed. So in that sense, to your question, to what extent is the current negotiations on CAP reform giving you headaches? A lot, to be very honest, because it's a CAP non-reform, what we are seeing at the moment. And that is a problem, because we are putting policies in place basically for this decade now. And if you look, and again here, I agree to a large extent again what Mauro said. He must be getting very nervous at the moment. But if you then look at what we are doing on CAP for the moment, and we is also a majority of the European Parliament, it's a non-reform. It's on paper, we are talking about eco schemes, so there is mentioning of greening, there's mentioning of climate policies. But if you then look at what exactly we mean by that, because then the words matter, the legislation matters, what we mean by that, you do see that if we continue like this, basically current agriculture practices can continue and can fall under the name of eco schemes. I mean, the idea is, of course, that you will see a change of policies, because at the moment, agriculture is contributing to climate emissions. And they can be a sector that plays a crucial role in abating, and they have to play a crucial role in adapting. So agriculture and climate should be very closely linked. And unfortunately, in the current policy debates, we are not really making that link. So I'm happy here that the European Commission at least has said, well, we are not happy with how the debate is going. But of course, now the big question is, what does that mean? Because if we now look at the positions that the Council and the Parliament has taken, the conclusion is that the Green Deal in the agriculture sector is failing. So I sincerely hope that the Commission is going to be more active than just realizing that the two legislative institutions are not delivering. Now I have the floor. Can I just say one thing on the debate around natural sinks? Because here, and this is also maybe to Gert-Jan. I mean, I agree to a large extent what Gert-Jan said. But what we see now is that, of course, by including basically the land use into your target that Europe has set, so that is this famous net target, the entire land use sector is being drawn in this kind of target discussion. And that is making the target very vulnerable. First of all, you do get the next step, of course, is a huge debate about, but then should this also not be part of ETS? You heard Shell already. So just imagine, they are now getting public subsidies to develop CCS, and then later on they can earn money with negative emissions in ETS. So climate policies for Shell is going to be a money make machine. I'm not quite sure that is the entire idea, while then they still are exploring gas all over the world. This debate you want to separate, and that is really our criticism on the Commission. We are saying, yes, absolutely, we need land use policies, and the CAP reform should be part of that, but we also need forestry policies. So that is very crucial, but please keep it separated from the target discussion, because it's polluting the target discussion. It is a huge risk you get into the target discussion, and you get the ongoing link with ETS debates, which you already see evolving as we speak. And I think you don't want that. You just want to have a clear discussion on how are we going to improve agriculture policies and forestry policies to deliver on better sinks and carbon sequestration. That's what we want. And please stay out of this target discussion.
That means that Mauro's suggestions that the Commission is looking into carbon certificates is already scaring you. Mauro, please.
I didn't think.
And Janneke afterwards.
I didn't think Bas was so easily scared. At least it's the first time I managed, which is a bit of an achievement. Look, first of all, carbon removal certificates in the ETS, niet. No way. It would completely change the nature of the instrument, and that isn't the point. Carbon removal certificates as an instrument for the flexibility that we have in the effort sharing regulation and in the land use regulation, why not? That process exists already and it's not regulated. So we need to regulate it and we need to give it stability and solidity. Just look at the horror that it's going to be bestowed upon us by international instruments on aviation, which in principle are a fantastic idea, but the material to make it happen in a real way is not there. If we had internationally agreed accounting and certification rules, then instruments like Corsia would be a very good thing. As it is, it worries us. And we will start by creating a European system of accounting and certification. And on that basis, we will inform our negotiating action. As to the point, we should keep them separate. Plus, we agree on what we want to achieve. I think we seem to be taking two very different routes to that. Putting into the target, it means obliging people to care for it. It means obliging member states to actually do things, because at the moment, it's a perfect excuse. It's a perfect excuse not to change practices in forestry and agriculture, because in any event, it doesn't matter. Whatever we do, you guys won't take it into account. So why should we spend time and resources? And at the end of the day, the net zero concept for 2050 is net of the carbon sink. That's what the entire world is doing. That's what the science in the IPCC tells us to do. We can't continue to create a totally artificial system which doesn't match. Yes, I don't discount in any way the risks that Bas sees. I think they're there. But sorry, so are many other risks in what we do. I think our job as policymaker and policy deciders is to acknowledge those risks, not pretend that they're not there, and counter them. And I think this is the time to do it because we have the strength to do it. Maybe 5 years ago, it would have been too dangerous. I would have agreed with Bas that it wasn't a good idea. But I think that now we can do it, and we can do it in a way that that's properly managed. We will have that discussion in the Parliament beginning with next summer, and I'm looking forward to that.
Wonderful. Thanks, Mauro. I think everyone is looking forward to those political fights. But before that, I would like to turn quickly to Janneke, who had wanted to say something, and then give David a minute to respond to some of the comments. First Janneke, then David, and then Gert-Jan. Thanks.
Thank you. Just a short comment on the discussion. I think we need to look beyond the oil and gas sector when we're talking about both CCS and also negative emissions, and look to the industry and the industrial emission points that can really contribute to negative emissions, which we need to reach the climate goals. And for that, we need a system to actually measure and incentivize this capture or this decarbonization of a bio-CCS or biological emissions. And I think different industries, such as waste to energy, can contribute on a large scale to achieving those negative emissions. And we really need to push forward on the incentives, on the standards, to find ways to finance these projects and to achieve these, to realize this project and achieve these negative emissions. Thank you.
Indeed, it's not just the fossil fuel industry we're talking about, but as you say, the hard-to-abate industry. And with that, I would, however, quickly come back to the fossil fuel industry. And David, you have a minute to comment.
Great. Well, good. Well, thank you very much. So I did want to respond to the comments made by Bas in particular. So I think it's perhaps a little unfair to criticise Shell for supporting the emissions trading system. I mean, I think back, I've been involved in the climate discussion for a very long time, and I think back to 2003 when you could count on one hand the number of companies that supported the ETS and felt that it was the right way forward, and Shell was amongst those companies. And I remember at the time both the Commission and many MEPs were very grateful of having any industry support at all. We've never ever said that the ETS is the only policy that's required. The ETS sits within a framework, and that framework includes research and development into new technologies, which is certainly something that is important. It includes a step that requires some sort of additional policy for the early transition to a new technology. So that sort of valley of death, which and to get technologies over the line. And then you need a long-term deployment mechanism, and that's where the ETS comes in. CCS has been in that sort of middle section for a long time in terms of needing help to get it over the line. And I think the Norwegian government, as we heard from the minister, has really seen that and been a powerful driver in taking CCS forward, and we certainly appreciate that. The reason that I mentioned the need for the ETS is that, I've not seen a single credible analysis of 2050 that points to a world in which there's no use of fossil fuels, or an EU where there's no use of fossil fuels. It will be largely reduced, but there will still be some use of fossil fuels. And so you'll need to have some sort of balancing mechanism between remaining emissions and sinks. And the ETS is ideally designed to do that if we include sinks within it. But that's not the mechanism that will get CCS up and running in the very short term. That's going to require some sort of additional policies, policies that might look like the renewable obligation certificates, driving forward a specific amount of CCS into the economy as we drove forward a specific amount of CCS into the renewables into the economy with that obligation. So, the ETS is a cornerstone of EU policy, and I think we should build on it to incorporate removals, not dismiss it and think that we can just plan our way into the future. Thank you.
Thanks, David, for that. Now I would like to turn to Gert-Jan, who had wanted to comment before that.
Yes, thanks. Very quickly then, I do indeed fully understand the legal hassle of trying to get such a dynamic system as a natural system into a legal juridical text, where you have millions of owners and the sink may be large one year, the next year it may be very small, but we will need to incorporate the land sector in the total of in the whole set of the solution. If we cannot use fossil carbon anymore in the future, or far less fossil carbon, we will need renewable carbon, much more renewable carbon in the future. And therefore, you will need to set up the incentives to invest in agriculture and in forestry in the EU and also outside of the EU. There's no doubt in the science that we will need to do that, to adapt the system and to provide the renewable resources. And maybe, I'm not here to defend Shell, but there is an example where Shell in the Netherlands is investing in the Dutch State Forest Service in restoration of ash decline forest. Those are very good examples of private investments helping a public body for forest restoration. And these things, and it was mentioned, I think, by Mauro as well, is private capital. These private capital constructions will become much more, and will have to become much more important in the future.
Thanks for that, Gert-Jan, especially that you bring, or at least raise the issue of private funds. I think that's something that's definitely becoming more and more crucial, especially now that we're in moving into a recession. The COVID pandemic has done great things for the economy, and so I think the discussion about where funds come back and come from, and what public and private companies are funding is going to be quite central. But of course, as Bas and others have said, the issue is how do you create a regulatory framework to make sure that the money that is going into projects actually provides the results, and of course that that money in itself doesn't become greenwashing, which is something that, at least also for policymakers, has become more and more of a concern as the whole world essentially is embracing green products and green activities, to actually distinguish what really is green and what is not. And I think based on what the European Commission has been doing, it's become clear that it's an increasing concern also for financial regulation, for example. So I think that's an interesting point to raise. With that, I think I'm just going to look through the last questions with Slido, because we have like the last minutes just to get some of the final comments in. There's one question from Anonymous that has just come up, which asks, how about redirecting fossil fuel subsidies, at least partly, to better develop sink maintenance and approval for agriculture and forestry? And I would like to have the whole panel give a one-line answer whether that's something to make something good, at least, with a system that is not ideal as of yet. Bas, I'll start with you.
Well, first of all, I'm not sure you need to link them as the question is doing it. But first of all, I think the governments have promised now already for years at all levels, G20, G8, OECD, to stop with fossil subsidies, and they still haven't done so. So that is absolutely one of the fights that we still need to have, is to put those promises into action. So I think there also, by the way, the European Commission can be a bit stronger on countries, because, you know, we have semester, we have economic governance, and there the European Commission could also use those kind of mechanisms to really put that fight much more concretely on the table. And then on the other hand, absolutely, we need better policies for land use and increasing sequestration. And as I said, also adaptation of agriculture. For that, for example, we do already have money, which is called CAP, the Common Agriculture Policies. I mean, we do 1/3 of the EU budget is going to agriculture already. We're just not using that money properly. And that is the problem. So I'm not quite sure that you would stop fossil subsidies and then put that in another bowl. I would say, yes, stop with fossil subsidies. But on the other hand, just maybe first try to do a good and proper cap reform. And then let's see what kind of money is still needed. But in that sense, agree with both, but maybe not to link it as the question did.
Janneke, how best make use of state subsidies?
Well, I think we definitely need to channel state subsidies towards effective measures to reduce emissions, and that possibly it could be a good idea to reroute some of the subsidizations. But this is not my core competence, so I think I'll stop there.
Okay, Gert-Jan?
Yeah, this is also not really my field as a forester, so maybe I
So as a forester, any money you get, you'll take it.
Yeah, well, you can indeed. Well, the challenge is indeed, well, you know, the forest competence is still very much at the member states level. So the member states need to devise, together with the Commission, they need to devise the right incentives and the triggers for all these measures that I mentioned, this adaptation of the system, the biodiversity conservation, and at the same time providing these renewable resources that we need. And I know that's general terminology. In practice and in reality, really on the ground, how exactly you do that, that's a major challenge.
Mauro?
I mean, first of all, I agree with Bas. The fact that we are wasting money on fossil fuel subsidies doesn't mean that we can't do the things we need to do with public funds. There's enough money to do what we have to do. Yes, it's not a good idea to continue to subsidize fossil fuels. We should stop. At the same time, we should also ask ourselves why we're doing it. And while there are plenty of bad reasons, some reasons cannot be ignored. Some of the fossil fuels are detaxation of fuel for the fishing fleet. Some of them are detaxation of fuel for agricultural machinery. You cannot ignore this. We're never going to be able to eliminate those fossil fuels if we don't find another way to take care of the problem that they are designed to address, which, by the way, they address at best in only a partial manner. So it's not even as if they are an effective tool for those problems, but it doesn't make the problems less real or less keenly felt. So I think we cannot simply focus, fossil fuel subsidies are bad, let's get rid of them, there's a better use for the money. All that is true, but what do we do to address the problem that those subsidies were meant to remedy, even if they've done a bad job of that? And then there are things like the zero tax on kerosene, which is a little bit more difficult to swallow. And there is the fact that the most taxed form of energy in Europe is electricity, for a variety of reasons. So the problem is bigger than fossil fuel subsidy, because there are hardly in Europe any straight subsidy, cash in hand. They're all fiscal measures. And when it comes to fiscal measure, we have a hell of a big job to do. The Commission will make a proposal on the Energy Taxation Directive. Now, on that one, I make no prediction. Discussion with member states on taxation is notoriously a very dicey affair.
Good. Then I won't. Then I will finish this with a final question, and I just would like very, very short answers. Mark Preston asked on Slido, what happens if the demand for removals far exceeds supply? And I start with Janneke.
If the demand for removals far exceeds the supply of CO2,
yeah,
I don't see that happening in the near future. As I mentioned, we have large emission points, especially from my perspective, the industrial emission points that we need to address and that we need to find effective measures for. so as long as we manage to roll out this technology to capture that CO2, these hard to abate emissions, I can't really see that there will be a problem with supply. However, it demands that we're able to build to establish the value chains for transport and storage as well.
Excellent. Thank you for that answer, Bas. Can demand for removals ever exceed supply?
Well, if you ask it like that, everything can happen, of course, in the future. You never know. But I think this boils down again to the question, okay, where do we really need the removals, right? And that should be our assessment. And I think that boils down a bit back to where we started from, also how Mauro started. Where are the unabatable emissions? And clearly in the land use sector, clearly in some of the industrial applications, and let's see there on how we are going to make sure that we can put the removals in place there. And I think if we do a bit more of a structured approach there, then we don't run into these kind of issues.
Thank you. Gert-Jan?
Yeah, well, when demand goes over the supply, then simply the price goes up. That's an old economic law. So that may lead to good incentives, triggers for increasing the land-based sinks and providing renewables as well. But of course, then you also start to run into the risk that cowboys start to play in this arena, and some of the other panelists have pointed at that sort of risks as well. So that will give other challenges.
Thanks for that. And Mauro, final answer.
I agree with Gert-Jan, totally. And that's why we need a legal framework. Markets are a great thing. No market operates in the wilderness. We need market rules, and then let the market play. And we will propose market rules for carbon removals, at least in Europe. And then we'll see how much we can negotiate to have international rules, which would be the ultimate goal. But, it's a bit of a longer term.
Thank you. Well, thanks for that final comment. Then I think with this, I will close the panel and release you all into the wilderness of your home working experience. And just to quickly recap, I think the discussion very much centered about the possibilities and challenges of carbon removal and natural sinks. I'm grateful for the panel, especially Bas, Janneke, Gert-Jan and Mauro for spending this time with us, and Tina Bru to discuss Norway's experience. And just a few housekeeping remarks. Thanks to Shell for making this event possible. Thanks to our audience members for participating. And please send feedback to help us improve our events to feedback at events@politico.eu. Thank you very much for being so active on Slido. I hope I managed to at least ask some of the questions that you wanted raised, and I look forward to engaging with viewers in the future. As you can expect, Politico will continue hosting more virtual events and discussions, and so please do check out and join in the future. Thank you very much. This is it from me, and have a good Wednesday.